Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. Even as a child, I loved everything about it. The lights, the music, the decorations, the feeling that for a few brief weeks, people became softer and kinder than usual. 17 years into marriage, that feeling still mattered to me, maybe more than ever, because by then, Christmas had become something else too. A chance to believe things could improve, a chance to imagine that whatever distance had quietly settled between Marcus and I might somehow disappear beneath twinkling lights and wrapped presents. Every year, I decorated the house with the same optimism. Every year, I convinced myself that maybe this would be the year we found our way back to each other. That particular Christmas felt different. Not better, more fragile. Marcus had spent months talking about money, or rather the lack of it. Whenever I suggested a weekend trip, he said we couldn't afford it. When our washing machine started making alarming noises, he insisted we wait before replacing it. When I mentioned updating the guest room, he laughed and called it unnecessary. We need to be careful right now. That became his favorite phrase. Careful, responsible, temporary sacrifices. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Marriage requires trust, or at least I thought it did. By December, I had adjusted my expectations. No vacation, no major purchases, no expensive celebrations, just a quiet Christmas together. Honestly, I was fine with that. I wasn't asking for luxury, I was asking for connection. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. The tree lights glowed softly in the living room, wrapping paper covered the floor, coffee filled the house with warmth. For a few hours, everything felt normal, comfortable, almost happy. Then Marcus handed me a small velvet box. I looked at him in surprise. The box itself seemed expensive, far more expensive than anything we had discussed buying. "You didn't have to do that," he smiled. "Open it." I lifted the lid. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Inside sat a diamond necklace, elegant, beautiful, far beyond anything I expected. The diamonds caught the light from the Christmas tree and scattered tiny reflections across the room. My first reaction wasn't suspicion, it was confusion, because nothing about it made sense. Money had supposedly been tight, painfully tight, yet somehow Marcus had purchased jewelry worth more than anything he'd ever given me before. "It's beautiful," I whispered, and it truly was. Marcus smiled proudly. "You deserve it." The words landed exactly where he intended. For a moment, I believed them. For a moment, I felt seen, appreciated, loved. The distance that had existed between us for years seemed smaller, not gone, just smaller. The rest of Christmas passed peacefully. We visited family, exchanged phone calls, watched holiday movies. Normal things, ordinary things. The necklace remained around my neck for most of the day. Every time I caught sight of it, I smiled, not because of its value, because of what I thought it represented: effort, affection, hope. 2 days later, I was cleaning the living room. The holiday decorations remained. The wrapping paper was mostly gone. Life was slowly returning to normal. I knelt beside the couch, reaching for a piece of crumpled paper trapped underneath. At first, I barely looked at it. I assumed it was trash, another leftover from Christmas morning. I almost threw it away. Then I noticed the logo, a jewelry store. The same jewelry store Marcus had mentioned when I admired a display window months earlier. My hand froze. For reasons I couldn't explain, I unfolded the receipt, slowly, carefully. what I saw would change everything. But at that moment, sitting on the living room floor with a forgotten piece of paper in my hand, I had no idea that the smallest discovery of my marriage was about to expose its biggest secret. I unfolded the receipt, expecting confirmation. Nothing more. Maybe the purchase date, maybe the price, maybe proof that Marcus had spent more than he should have on Christmas. At worst, I assumed I would find evidence of financial irresponsibility. I was not prepared for what I actually found. The receipt listed the necklace, my necklace, the same item resting upstairs in my jewelry box, the same item Marcus had proudly placed in my hands on Christmas morning. I studied the details. The purchase amount made my eyes widen. More than $10,000. I read the number twice, then 3 times. The amount seemed impossible. For months, Marcus had been talking about budget concerns, delaying repairs, rejecting vacations, questioning expenses. Yet somehow, $10,000 had appeared for a necklace. My stomach tightened. But that wasn't the part that frightened me. Not yet. My eyes drifted lower and stopped. There was a second item listed. At first, I assumed it was an accessory, a warranty, a cleaning service, something routine. Then I read the description. Diamond necklace. The exact same model, the exact same specifications, the exact same price. My pulse quickened. I looked again, certain I was misunderstanding something, but the details remained unchanged. 2 necklaces, not 1, 2, purchased 6 months apart. The first purchased in June, the second purchased just before Christmas. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I sat down on the couch, the receipt trembling slightly in my hands, because one question immediately appeared. Why would anyone buy 2 identical diamond necklaces? The explanation didn't come, only discomfort. Then I noticed something else, a delivery address. Not our home, not Marcus's office, not any location I recognized. An unfamiliar address, across town. My heartbeat accelerated. Slowly, I reached for my phone, typed the address into a search engine. The results appeared instantly. Luxury condominium building, private residences, upscale neighborhood, the kind of place people chose intentionally, the kind of place that cost a great deal of money. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to force the information into a version of reality that still made sense. But every explanation felt weaker than the one I was trying desperately not to consider. The receipt remained in my lap, silent, unemotional, just paper, yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I'd held in years. That evening, Marcus returned home carrying groceries, the same casual smile, the same familiar routine, the same comfortable confidence. For several minutes, I watched him move around the kitchen, talking about work, complaining about traffic, discussing weekend plans. And suddenly, I found myself wondering something unsettling. How much of this was real? Not the groceries, not the conversation. Him. How much of Marcus did I actually know? The thought lingered throughout the dinner, through the dishes, through the evening. I said nothing, not because I was afraid, because I needed more information. One receipt wasn't proof. It was a question, a very disturbing question, but still a question. Before going to bed, I carefully folded the receipt and placed it inside a drawer, hidden, protected, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every possibility seemed worse than the one before it. An affair, a secret apartment, financial deception, another life. My mind cycled endlessly through scenarios. By sunrise, I reached a conclusion. I wasn't ready to confront Marcus. Not yet. If something was wrong, I needed facts, not assumptions, evidence, not emotions. The receipt had opened a door. Now I needed to find out what was waiting behind it. And deep down, I already suspected I wasn't going to like the answer. For the next several days, I carried the receipt everywhere. Not physically, mentally. Every conversation with Marcus felt different. Every interaction seemed filtered through a new question. Who bought the first necklace? The uncertainty followed me everywhere, at work, at home, even during ordinary moments, especially during ordinary moments, because deception hides best inside routine. Marcus didn't seem nervous, didn't seem distracted, didn't seem like a man protecting a secret. If anything, he appeared unusually relaxed. That bothered me. People imagine dishonesty looks obvious. In reality, it often looks completely normal. One afternoon, while Marcus was at work, I returned to the receipt. This time, I studied every detail: transaction numbers, dates, store information, everything. Eventually, one detail caught my attention: the purchase date of the first necklace, June 14, exactly 6 months before Christmas. I stared at the date, trying to remember whether anything significant had happened that week. At first, nothing came to mind. Then I remembered. Marcus had traveled for business, or at least that's what he told me. 3 days away, conference meetings, client dinners, the usual explanation, the kind I'd heard many times before. My stomach tightened because suddenly the timing felt less like coincidence and more like a clue. I opened our credit card records. Months of statements appeared on the screen. At first, everything looked ordinary: groceries, utilities, gas stations, restaurants, the normal rhythm of family life. Then I reached June, and the pattern changed. There were charges I didn't recognize: expensive restaurant bills, luxury hotel payments, transportation services. None of them appeared outrageous on their own. Together, they told a different story. A story about someone spending money very differently than he claimed. I wrote down every charge, every date, every location. The list grew quickly, far quicker than I expected. By evening, an uncomfortable realization settled over me. The marriage I thought I understood seemed to contain entire sections I had never seen, entire stories I had never been told. One evening, I opened my jewelry box and looked at the necklace. The diamonds sparkled exactly as they had on Christmas morning. Beautiful, elegant, perfect. A gift I once believed represented love. Now I wasn't so sure, and for the first time I found myself wondering whether the necklace had ever really been meant for me at all. The more I investigated, the harder it became to stop. Not because I enjoyed uncovering secrets, because every answer created 2 new questions. The receipt led to the credit card statements. The statements led to the hotel charges. The hotel charges led to Rebecca. And Rebecca seemed to be everywhere. Not openly, carefully, quietly, like someone who existed just outside the edge of my life. I began organizing everything: dates, transactions, locations, receipts, notes. What started as curiosity had become a timeline, and the timeline was beginning to tell a story, one I didn't want to hear. Several of the hotel charges matched dates Marcus claimed he was traveling for work. At first, I hoped there would be inconsistencies, mistakes, gaps, something that proved I was jumping to conclusions. Instead, the evidence fit together with disturbing precision. Business trip, hotel reservation, luxury restaurant, transportation charges, jewelry purchase. The pattern repeated again and again, too consistently to ignore. One afternoon, while reviewing statements from the previous year, I found another charge connected to June: a private dining reservation. Expensive, exclusive, the type of place Marcus and I had never visited because, according to him, it was too costly. The reservation date matched June 14, the same day as the first necklace purchase. My chest tightened because suddenly the timeline wasn't abstract anymore, it was personal. Someone received that necklace. Someone sat across from Marcus at dinner. Someone celebrated a birthday or anniversary or special occasion while I believed he was attending business meetings. That realization hurt more than I expected, not because of jealousy, because of the planning. Affairs are painful, but planning requires intention, and intention changes everything. That evening, Marcus came home smiling. He asked what I wanted for dinner. He asked how my day went. He kissed my forehead before heading upstairs. The normality of it all felt surreal. For years, I had blamed myself for the growing distance between us. I wondered whether I worked too much, whether I complained too often, whether I had somehow become less interesting, less attractive, less enough. Now, those thoughts felt different because the evidence suggested the distance didn't begin with me, it began with dishonesty, and dishonesty has a way of creating distance long before anyone notices. A few days later, I finally searched Rebecca's name directly, not obsessively, not dramatically, just carefully. Public information only, professional profiles, social media, basic records. Eventually, I found her. The moment her photograph appeared on my screen, I felt strangely calm. Not angry, not emotional, calm. Because uncertainty had been exhausting. At least now, uncertainty was beginning to disappear. Rebecca was real, not a theory, not a possibility, a real person, professional, successful, living in the same city. The condominium address from the receipt belonged to her building. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I hated her, because I was trying to understand how much of my life had been built around things I didn't know. The answer increasingly seemed to be a lot. That night, I opened the jewelry box again. The necklace rested exactly where I'd left it, the same diamonds, the same shine, the same elegant design. Nothing about it had changed, yet everything had changed, because now I understood something I hadn't understood on Christmas morning. The necklace wasn't proof of love, it was proof of strategy. A duplicate purchase, a matching gift, a way to hide evidence in plain sight. The realization settled heavily over me, because if Marcus had purchased one necklace for Rebecca and another identical necklace for me, then Christmas hadn't been a romantic gesture, it had been damage control, and somehow that truth hurt even more than the affair itself. For several days after discovering Rebecca, I did almost nothing. At least that's how it looked from the outside. I went to work, made dinner, paid bills, answered emails, laughed when appropriate, smiled when expected. Normal life continued. But internally, everything had changed. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the reevaluation, the constant revisiting of memories, conversations, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries. Moments I once considered ordinary now seemed suspicious. Not because every memory was false, because I no longer knew which ones were real. That uncertainty was exhausting. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing financial records when a realization stopped me cold. The spending wasn't occasional, it was systematic. At first, I had focused on the necklace, then the hotels, then the dinners. Now I was seeing the larger picture. Thousands of dollars, year after year, month after month. Not hidden cash, not private spending. Joint accounts, shared credit cards, family resources. Money Marcus and I earned together. Money intended for our future, retirement, savings, security. Instead, Significant portions of it had quietly funded another relationship, another life. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the scale of it. The affair itself was painful, but the financial betrayal added a different layer because it transformed deception into theft. Not legally, perhaps, but emotionally. Every hidden expense represented a choice, every transaction represented a decision, and every decision had been made without my knowledge. The next morning, I called an attorney, not because I was ready to file for divorce, because I needed clarity. The meeting took place a week later. I brought everything: the receipt, the statements, the hotel charges, the notes, the timeline. The attorney reviewed it all carefully, page after page, document after document, occasionally asking questions, occasionally making notes, mostly listening. When she finally looked up, her expression remained calm, professional, experienced, the kind of expression that told me she had seen situations like mine before. That thought saddened me more than I expected, because it meant I wasn't unique. This kind of betrayal happened often, far too often. "You've done good work," she said. The compliment surprised me. I hadn't thought of it as work, only survival. She pointed toward the receipt. "Everything starts here." I nodded. The forgotten receipt, the piece of paper Marcus never realized he'd left behind. The smallest mistake in a carefully maintained deception. The attorney continued reviewing the records. Eventually, she reached a conclusion I had already begun reaching myself. "This appears to be long-term." The words felt strangely validating, not comforting, validating, because for months, maybe years, I had sensed something was wrong. The distance, the secrecy, the unexplained absences. I simply lacked proof. Now, the proof existed, and proof changes everything. Before I left, the attorney offered one piece of advice, the same advice I would hear repeatedly over the coming months. Don't confront him yet. I understood immediately. The moment Marcus knew I was aware, everything would change. Records could disappear, accounts could move, evidence could vanish. Right now, he believed his secret remained safe, and that assumption was creating opportunities. As I drove home, I thought about Christmas morning, about the smile, the velvet box, the necklace, the words, "You deserve it." For weeks, I had focused on whether the necklace was originally meant for Rebecca. Now I realized that wasn't the most important question. The most important question was this: how many other gifts had really been distractions? How many romantic gestures had actually been attempts to hide something? And if the necklace wasn't what it appeared to be, what else in my marriage wasn't what it appeared to be? Either. The attorney's advice turned out to be correct. The longer Marcus believed everything was normal, the more information became available. Not because he grew careless, because he remained comfortable. Comfortable people rarely expect scrutiny, and Marcus had spent years assuming nobody was looking. Over the following months, my investigation expanded, carefully, quietly, methodically. I wasn't searching for reasons anymore. I already had those. I was searching for facts. Facts survive arguments. Facts survive excuses. Facts survive manipulation. The financial records became increasingly revealing. Additional hotel reservations surfaced, travel expenses, luxury purchases, special occasions, anniversaries that weren't mine, celebrations I never attended, entire experiences funded through accounts I believed belonged to our shared future. Each discovery hurt, but not in the same way. The first discoveries felt like wounds. The later discoveries felt like confirmation, and confirmation carries less shock than revelation. One afternoon, the attorney introduced me to a forensic accountant. Within 30 minutes, I understood why. The accountant noticed patterns I would never have seen, connections hidden inside ordinary transactions, relationships between dates, recurring spending habits, behavioral trends. The evidence stopped looking like isolated incidents. It started looking like a system, a very expensive system. The accountant estimated that over several years, thousands upon thousands of dollars had been directed toward the affair. The number made me stare silently across the conference table, not because of the amount itself, because every dollar represented a choice, a deliberate decision, a prioritization. Marcus hadn't simply been dishonest, he had been investing in dishonesty. The distinction mattered. The investigation uncovered something else as well. The timing. The affair had not started recently. It hadn't begun during a difficult period in our marriage. It hadn't emerged after years of distance. In fact, much of the distance seemed to appear after the affair began. That realization changed everything. For years, I believed our marriage was struggling first, and that everything else followed. Now the evidence suggested the opposite. The deception came first. The distance came afterward. The loneliness, the secrecy, the emotional withdrawal, all of it. The cause and effect had been reversed, and for the first time in years, I stopped blaming myself. That may have been the most important discovery of all. Not Rebecca, not the hotels, not even the necklace, the realization that I wasn't responsible for someone else's dishonesty. The realization felt liberating, painful, but liberating. One evening, Marcus sat across from me during dinner, discussing retirement plans. The irony nearly took my breath away. He spoke confidently, comfortably, as if we were planning a future together. Meanwhile, evidence continued accumulating inside folders stored in my attorney's office, evidence proving he had spent years quietly building a different future, a separate one, a hidden one. I watched him talk, listened carefully, and suddenly something became clear. Marcus wasn't protecting our marriage, he was managing appearances. There is a difference, a profound difference. One values truth, the other values perception. For years, perception had been enough. Now it wasn't. Several weeks later, my attorney called with an update. The financial analysis was nearly complete. The records were organized, the timelines were established, the evidence was strong, very strong. Strong enough that she felt comfortable asking the question we had both been avoiding. What do you want to do next? I already knew the answer. Not because I stopped loving Marcus, because I stopped recognizing him. The man described in those financial records wasn't the man I believed I married. And if 17 years of marriage had taught me anything, it was this. You can rebuild after hardship. You can rebuild after mistakes. But rebuilding requires honesty. Without honesty, there is nothing stable enough to rebuild upon. A week later, I signed the papers, and for the first time since finding the receipt beneath the couch, I stopped searching for the truth, because I finally had it. Marcus received the divorce papers on a Tuesday afternoon. I know because he called me less than 20 minutes later. The first call went unanswered, so did the second and the third. By the time I arrived home that evening, there were already several messages waiting. Angela, please call me. We need to talk. There has to be some mistake. The last message almost made me laugh. A mistake? The word felt strangely familiar. For months I had searched for one. A banking error, a misunderstanding, an innocent explanation, some mistake that could make everything I discovered disappear. None existed. Now Marcus seemed eager to find one. Unfortunately for him, the evidence wasn't interested in helping. When he arrived home later that night, he looked unsettled, not angry, confused, as if the possibility of consequences had never fully occurred to him. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where so many discoveries had unfolded, the same table where I had reviewed receipts, statements, and timelines while he slept upstairs believing his secrets remained hidden. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you talk to me first?" The question hung in the air. I stared at him, genuinely amazed, not because he asked it, because he seemed sincere. For years he hid hotel reservations, jewelry purchases, financial records, an entire relationship. Yet somehow he believed I owed him a conversation before seeking legal advice. The irony was almost overwhelming. I tried talking for years. The words emerged calmly, more calmly than I expected. Marcus looked away. That reaction told me more than any explanation could, because deep down, I think he knew it was true. For years, I raised concerns, questions, observations, small worries. Each time they were dismissed, explained away, minimized. Now those unanswered questions sat between us like physical objects. Marcus tried several approaches: confusion, justification, context, explanations. Each one sounded carefully chosen. Each one sounded familiar. The problem was that explanations work differently once evidence exists. Before evidence, explanations create uncertainty. After evidence, they create contradictions, and contradictions rarely help. Eventually, I opened a folder. The receipt rested inside. The receipt, the forgotten piece of paper that changed everything. I placed it on the table. Marcus stared at it. His expression shifted immediately, not dramatically, subtly, but enough. The moment he recognized the receipt, something changed. For the first time, the confidence disappeared. Because unlike conversations, receipts don't forget. Unlike memories, they don't change. Unlike stories, they don't adapt. They simply remain, silent, accurate, persistent. Marcus looked down at the document for a long time. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. The receipt was speaking clearly enough. Finally, he exhaled slowly, and in that moment, I realized something important. The affair wasn't ending because Marcus chose honesty. It was ending because honesty had caught up to him. There is a difference. One deserves respect. The other merely reflects reality. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, Marcus admitted more than I expected. Not everything. People rarely confess everything, but enough. Enough to confirm the timeline, enough to confirm Rebecca, enough to confirm the necklace, enough to confirm what I already knew. When he finally left the kitchen, I remained seated, quiet, exhausted, not because the truth hurt, because carrying it had been heavy, and for the first time in months, I wasn't carrying it alone. Marcus knew I knew. The secrecy was over. The investigation was complete. Now the legal process would begin, and unlike private conversations, the legal process cared very little about explanations. It cared about evidence. Fortunately, I had plenty of that. Once the divorce proceedings officially began, everything changed. Not emotionally, practically. For months, I had been collecting information, organizing records, building timelines, preparing. Now those preparations had a purpose. The evidence was no longer sitting quietly inside folders. It was moving into court filings, financial disclosures, legal documents, official records. The transition felt significant because private suspicions become very different when they enter public proceedings. Suddenly, every transaction mattered, every charge, every transfer, every purchase. The attorney requested detailed financial disclosures from Marcus: accounts, assets, credit cards, investments, spending histories, everything, or at least everything he admitted existed. The process revealed something interesting. People who hide one thing often hide several. Not always, often enough. As the records arrived, the financial picture became clearer and, unfortunately, more expensive. The affair had cost far more than I initially realized. Hotel stays, flights, luxury dinners, jewelry, entertainment, travel, special occasions. The expenses stretched across years, not months, years. I sat with my attorney reviewing the records one afternoon, page after page of spending, page after page of choices. The numbers themselves weren't shocking anymore. What shocked me was the consistency, the effort, the maintenance. Affairs require deception. Long-term affairs require management, financial management, emotional management, logistical management. The records documented all of it. One transaction in particular stood out: a birthday celebration for Rebecca, private dining, luxury accommodations, transportation services, and at the center of it all, the first necklace, the original necklace, the one purchased 6 months before Christmas, the one that explained everything. I stared at the transaction history for several moments because suddenly the entire sequence became obvious. Marcus purchased the first necklace for Rebecca. Months later, he purchased an identical one for me. Not because he felt generous, because matching gifts create camouflage. If one woman discovers the necklace, it appears less suspicious, less unique, less revealing. The strategy was clever until it wasn't, until a forgotten receipt slipped beneath a couch, until chance interrupted planning. The attorney shook her head while reviewing the records, not dramatically, just enough to express disbelief. People always underestimate paper trails. The observation stayed with me because it was true. Marcus spent years protecting conversations, protecting appearances, protecting stories. Meanwhile, the financial records quietly documented everything: every hotel, every reservation, every gift, every lie. The evidence wasn't emotional, it wasn't angry, it wasn't seeking revenge. It simply existed, and existence was enough. A few weeks later, additional records revealed that many of the affair-related expenses had been paid using joint accounts. That detail mattered legally a great deal, because the issue was no longer simply infidelity. It became financial misconduct, shared resources used without transparency, shared resources used to support a secret relationship. The distinction strengthened the case significantly. For the first time since filing, I saw genuine concern from Marcus's legal team. Not panic, concern. The kind that appears when evidence begins speaking more loudly than explanations. As the hearing dates approached, I found myself thinking less about Rebecca, less about the affair, less about Marcus, and more about the future. The shift happened gradually, almost without noticing. For months, my life revolved around discovery. Now it was beginning to revolve around recovery. The difference felt important because discovery looks backward, recovery looks forward, and after everything I had learned, forward was the only direction that interested me anymore. Still, one thing remained true. None of this would have happened without that receipt. The smallest piece of evidence remained one of the strongest. A single forgotten detail, a single overlooked mistake, a single piece of paper that quietly connected every part of the story. And soon, that story would be presented in a courtroom where explanations mattered far less than documentation. The first court hearing felt strangely ordinary. After everything that had happened, I expected something dramatic. Tension, confrontation, a sense of finality. Instead, the courtroom looked exactly like every courtroom I'd ever seen. Wooden benches, stacks of files, people carrying coffee cups, ordinary surroundings for extraordinary decisions. My attorney arrived carrying several evidence binders. Months of investigation sat inside those binders. Financial records, credit card statements, travel histories, purchase receipts, thousands of pages documenting years of deception. Across the room, Marcus sat beside his attorney. For a moment, I studied him carefully. The familiarity felt strange. 17 years of marriage creates a unique kind of recognition. You know someone's expressions, their habits, their reactions. Yet somehow he looked unfamiliar. Not because his appearance had changed, because my understanding of him had. The hearing began with procedural matters, financial disclosures, asset summaries, property records. The legal process moved methodically. No dramatic speeches, no emotional confrontations, just facts, one after another. The attorney had warned me this would happen. Courtrooms aren't designed for closure, they're designed for documentation. That distinction became obvious quickly. The financial evidence came first. Joint accounts, credit card activity, patterns of spending, timelines. The records told the story far more effectively than any witness could, because records don't become defensive. They don't forget details. They don't revise history. They simply remain. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, especially the spending connected to the affair. Luxury dinners, hotel stays, travel, jewelry purchases, every transaction supported by documentation, every transaction connected to dates and locations. The consistency was difficult to ignore. At one point, the judge requested clarification regarding the necklace purchases. The room grew noticeably quieter because everyone understood their significance. The first necklace, the second necklace, the matching purchases, the timeline, the receipt. The attorney explained everything clearly. The original gift purchased for Rebecca, the duplicate purchased months later for me, the apparent attempt to reduce suspicion, the forgotten receipt that exposed both purchases. Listening to it summarized so simply felt surreal. Months of confusion reduced to a straightforward sequence of facts, yet the facts remained powerful, perhaps because they were simple. Simple truths often are. The judge examined the records carefully, asked several questions, reviewed the documentation again. The receipt itself became a part of the discussion, a small piece of paper, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, yet impossible to explain away. For the first time since the proceedings began, I saw Marcus avoid eye contact entirely, not with me, with the evidence, as if refusing to look at it might somehow reduce its significance. It didn't. Evidence doesn't care where people look. During a brief recess, I stepped into the courthouse hallway. For months, I imagined this moment differently. I expected anger, bitterness, some overwhelming emotional release. Instead, I felt something unexpected, relief. Not because everything was finished, because uncertainty was finished. The uncertainty had been exhausting, far more exhausting than the truth itself. Truth can be painful, but uncertainty demands constant energy, constant doubt, constant questioning. I no longer carried those questions. The answers existed, the records existed, the evidence existed, and nothing Marcus said could change that. When the hearing resumed, the financial analysis continued. Additional records were presented, additional spending patterns reviewed, additional details examined. Each one reinforced the same conclusion. The affair wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a long-term decision, a series of choices repeated over years, choices funded through resources Marcus and I were supposed to share, choices documented far more thoroughly than he ever anticipated. And according to my attorney, the most significant findings had not even been presented yet. The strongest evidence was still waiting. The strongest evidence arrived during the final phase of the financial review. By then, months had passed since I found the receipt beneath the couch. Months of investigation, months of legal preparation, months of watching a hidden life slowly become visible through documents. Yet somehow, the evidence still managed to surprise me. Not because it revealed something entirely new, because it revealed the full scale of what had already happened. The forensic accountant presented a detailed summary of the spending, charts, timelines, account activity, patterns stretching across years. The presentation was methodical, almost clinical. No dramatic language, no emotional commentary, just numbers. And the numbers were devastating. The affair had not been funded occasionally. It had been funded consistently. Thousands of dollars, year after year. Special occasions, birthdays, vacations, luxury purchases, private dinners, hotel stays. The expenses accumulated into a figure far larger than I expected. For a moment, I simply stared at the report. Not because I couldn't understand it, because I finally could. Every transaction represented a decision. Every decision represented a priority, and priorities reveal truths that words often hide. The judge reviewed the summary cheerfully. Several times additional clarification was requested. Each explanation led back to the same conclusion: joint accounts, shared resources, undisclosed spending, a pattern impossible to dismiss as accidental. What struck me most wasn't the amount, it was the duration, the consistency, the years. Because maintaining a secret for years requires effort. Maintaining financial deception for years requires commitment. The records demonstrated both. One section of the report focused entirely on gifts, jewelry, luxury items, special purchases. The necklace appeared repeatedly, not because it cost the most, because it connected everything. The first necklace, the second necklace, the receipt, the discovery, the investigation. Without the necklace, none of this might have surfaced when it did. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, certainly not on me. The judge asked several questions about the duplicate purchases. The answers were straightforward. The timeline spoke clearly, the explanation spoke clearly, and the receipt spoke clearest of all. At one point, Marcus's attorney attempted to frame some of the spending as personal discretionary expenses. The argument wasn't unreasonable. Individuals often spend money without consulting spouses. That wasn't the issue. The issue was concealment. The issue was the scale. The issue was the purpose. The records addressed all three. By the end of the hearing, the distinction seemed obvious. The discussion gradually shifted away from proving what happened. That part was largely complete. The focus became consequences. Asset division, financial recovery, protections moving forward, future planning, practical outcomes. The attorney leaned toward me during a brief recess. "We're in a strong position." I nodded. Part of me appreciated hearing it. Another part already knew. Not because of legal strategy, because truth has a certain weight, and once enough truth accumulates, it becomes difficult to move around it. The hearing continued into the afternoon. By then, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. The explanations had become less important. The documentation had become more important. The evidence had become central, and the evidence was remarkably consistent. As the day ended, I gathered my notes slowly. The courtroom began emptying. People packed briefcases. Attorneys exchanged final comments. Court staff organized files. I remained seated for a moment, thinking, reflecting, not on the affair, not on Rebecca, not even on Marcus, on the receipt, the tiny piece of paper I nearly threw away. the tiny piece of paper that quietly waited beneath a couch until someone noticed it. Looking back, that seemed fitting, because the biggest lies often depend on the smallest details being ignored. And soon, the court would issue final decisions largely based on one thing Marcus never expected anyone to find: the detail he forgot to hide. The final hearing took place on a rainy morning. Gray clouds covered the city. People hurried through courthouse doors carrying umbrellas and briefcases. The weather felt appropriate, not dramatic, reflective, the kind of day that encourages people to think about where they've been and where they're going. By the time I entered the courtroom, I felt surprisingly calm. Months earlier, that would have seemed impossible. Back then, every discovery carried shock. Every document carried pain. Every answer created another question. Now the questions were gone, only decisions remained. The evidence had already done its work. The affair had been established, the financial records had been reviewed, the spending patterns had been documented, the timeline had been confirmed. Nothing significant remained hidden. That alone felt like a victory. The hearing focused primarily on outcomes: asset division, financial recovery, account disclosures, future protections, the practical side of rebuilding a life. My attorney presented the final summaries. The judge reviewed them carefully, methodically, professionally. The process felt less emotional than I once imagined, and honestly, I was grateful for that. Emotion had dominated enough of my life already. Facts were simpler. Facts asked less of me. One section of the proceedings addressed the misuse of joint accounts. The records spoke clearly. Thousands of dollars spent over multiple years. Travel, hotels, jewelry, entertainment, all funded through resources intended to support a shared future. The judge did not seem impressed, not by the explanations, not by the justifications, not by the attempts to minimize what happened. The documentation was too thorough, too consistent, too complete. Several financial adjustments were ordered, additional disclosures required. Certain assets received closer scrutiny. The legal language was precise, technical, sometimes difficult to follow, but the overall message remained obvious. Choices create consequences, and consequences had finally arrived. At one point, the necklace became part of the discussion again, not because of its value, because of its significance: the duplicate purchases, the receipt, the effort to conceal, the sequence of events that exposed everything. Listening to it summarized in court felt strange. A piece of jewelry that once symbolized love had become evidence. A forgotten receipt had become a key document. Meaning changes quickly when truth enters the picture. As the hearing approached its conclusion, I found myself studying the courtroom, the wooden benches, the stacks of files, the quiet professionalism. Months earlier, this place felt intimidating. Now it felt almost familiar. A place where facts were respected. A place where documentation mattered. A place where reality eventually caught up with appearances. That thought stayed with me, because appearances had protected Marcus for years. The image of a devoted husband, the image of financial responsibility, the image of honesty. Images are powerful until evidence arrives. Then evidence becomes more powerful. Late that afternoon, the judge issued the final rulings. The words were formal, measured, carefully structured, yet their meaning was unmistakable. The truth had been acknowledged, the financial misconduct had been documented, the consequences had been determined, and the future would no longer be built on hidden information. As people began gathering their belongings, I remained seated for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, because I wanted to remember the feeling. The feeling wasn't happiness, it wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was freedom. The freedom that arrives when uncertainty finally ends. The freedom that arrives when you stop questioning your instincts. The freedom that arrives when the truth no longer needs to be chased because it has already been found. I stood slowly, collected my notes, and walked toward the courthouse doors. The rain had stopped, the clouds were beginning to clear, and for the first time in a very long time, the future felt larger than the past. 3 years later, the necklace still sat inside my jewelry box, exactly where I left it, tucked carefully into its velvet case, protected, preserved, unworn. People often assumed I would have sold it, thrown it away, returned it if I could. After everything that happened, those reactions made sense, but I never considered any of them because the necklace meant something very different now. Its value had nothing to do with diamonds, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with Marcus. The necklace had become a reminder, a lesson, a symbol, not of betrayal, of truth. Life eventually settled into something peaceful, not perfect, peaceful. The difference matters. Perfection doesn't exist. Peace does. The years following the divorce were filled with small victories, the kind nobody applauds, the kind that quietly rebuild a life. Managing my own finances, making decisions without second-guessing myself, taking trips I had postponed for years, replacing things when they needed replacing instead of waiting for permission, learning to trust my instincts again. That last one took the longest, not because my instincts failed me, because I had spent years ignoring them. Looking back, I realized the signs existed long before the receipt. The distance, the secrecy, the unexplained absences, the uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't right. My instincts noticed those things. I simply didn't trust them enough. The receipt changed that, not because it gave me courage, because it gave me confirmation. And sometimes confirmation is exactly what people need. Friends occasionally asked whether I hated Marcus. The question appeared less often as time passed, but it still surfaced now and then. My answer always remained the same. No, I didn't hate him. Hate requires energy, attention, investment, and eventually I stopped giving him all three. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, and indifference arrived gradually, quietly, almost without notice. One afternoon, while organizing a closet, I found the original receipt. The receipt. The small folded piece of paper that had once been trapped beneath a couch. I smiled the moment I saw it, not because it brought back good memories, because it reminded me how powerful small details can be. A forgotten receipt. A simple piece of paper. Easy to overlook, easy to discard. Yet that tiny detail exposed years of deception, an affair, hidden spending, financial misconduct, a marriage built on information I never had. The largest truth in my life arrived disguised as the smallest clue. That realization never stopped fascinating me. As the sun set that evening, I carried the necklace box onto the back porch. The air felt warm, peaceful, comfortable. I opened the box and looked at the diamonds one last time. They sparkled exactly as they had on Christmas morning years earlier. Nothing about them had changed, only their meaning. Once I thought the necklace represented love, then I thought it represented betrayal. Now it represented something else entirely. Awareness, strength, self-trust. Proof that the truth has a way of revealing itself, even when people work very hard to hide it. I closed the box gently and carried it back inside, not with sadness, not with anger, with gratitude, because the Christmas gift receipt that nearly ended my world had ultimately saved it. The forgotten detail Marcus never noticed became the evidence he could never escape. and the necklace he used to hide a lie became a reminder that honesty always leaves a stronger legacy than deception. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe for more real-life inspired stories, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts.